I'm going to do the last one. A doubtful general who acts without principles and without plan, even though he lead an army numerically superior to that of the enemy, almost always finds himself inferior to the latter on the field of battle. Fumblings the middle course lose all in war. And I just like the fact that he's talking about principled leadership. And I would say that principled leadership, not just in a leadership position, but as a person. What are your principles as a person? And if you have principles as a human and you stand by those principles, you're going to be successful. You're going to win. Whereas if you take the middle course and you waver, or you don't have principles on which to stand, then you fall apart. And I think that everybody should look to define what their principles are.
Yeah.
Actually define them. Mm-hmm. I can tell you that, I would love to tell you that when I was, 19 years old, I sat down and wrote down Jocko's principles of life. I didn't do that. I wish I would have. And I can tell you that as I grew up in the SEAL teams, I probably added principles. And I added some bad ones and I added some good ones. Mm-hmm. And I think that those principles, though, when you get to a point where you know that your principles are solid, and honestly, to me, the best or the biggest thing I've done to define the principles that I live by is really the book that Leif and I wrote, Extreme Ownership. That was the culmination of 20 years in the SEAL teams and putting together the principles that I live by and to survive by. So I think it's just very important to think about what your principles are as a person, mm-hmm. what you're trying to achieve, and have those principles like a guiding strategy underneath everything that you're doing. Right. And that's one thing that's good about these podcasts is that, I've been lucky enough to capture some of these, like the letters that we read last time, these counseling letters. Mm-hmm. I'm talking about my personal principles in those. Those were my principles on how to lead. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's important to come up with those principles and define them and let those principles reflect, who you are as a person and what you want to be. And I wish that I would have been told to do that when I was 13 years old. Yeah. Because I think it is that important as a person.
Yeah. And it seems like, anyway, that defining your principles, it seems like that's kind of an ongoing process.
Yes.
Because it's one of those things where you think you have your principles, but I don't know, for example, you could have just heard it on some speech that really resonated with you. So you think you have these specific principles now, but you haven't really defined them. You just kind of liked how that sounded, and you maybe thought of 1, 2, 3 situations where, dang, that applies to me.
And let me tell you what you're talking about right now. Your number one principle should be free your mind and have humility to never say the principles that I'm standing upon are never going to change because I know everything right now. And we've talked about this before.
Yes.
I know I would, if I look at myself 10 years ago, I know nothing compared to what I know now.
Yeah.
If I looked at myself 20 years ago, I know even less. I'm just a lost animal out in the woods. So you have to, build these principles. And like you said, and I think there's a difference between being a flip-flopper. Like, you hear politicians get, you're a flip-flopper because you said you don't support gun control and now you do support it. Now you don't support it or whatever, or you do support bringing in refugees or not. So, and people get called a flip-flopper. Mm-hmm. And I think there's some core principles that shouldn't change, even for a politician and even for a person. Mm-hmm. But there's a lot of peripheral I think there's peripheral principles that do evolve and do change, and you do end up with different priorities in your life. And I think that's okay. There was a large portion of my life where the SEAL teams was absolutely the most important thing, and nothing else was even a close second, including things like my personal health, including things like my own family, including things like my future. Everything was just completely unimportant compared to the SEAL teams.
Right.
And while that makes for a fired up SEAL, and I wouldn't trade that, I wouldn't even want to change that principle. I mean, that's what I needed at the time to do a good job.
Right.
But, at some point I had to say, okay, I need to think about something else. Right. I need to evolve as a human.
Yeah.
And little things like I need to take care of my family. I need to actually pay attention to them and not just pay attention to my SEAL platoon or my SEAL task unit or the guys I'm working with. So I think it's okay to evolve your principles, but I think more important is that you need to define your principles and where you are. And that also is a way to check your growth and see what course you're on.
Yeah.
This is one thing that I talk about